Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Climate Emergency Centre Network wonderful Wednesday webinar. This week we have the honour to have the wisdom being dispensed by a very old friend, Roger Geffen, who's helped many campaigns down a lot of years for the environment, from early kind of London cycling campaigns through to Reclaim the Streets. And he's everything from CPRE to the campaign for better transport. He is an incredible man who's been at the heart of a lot of the movement. So Roger's going to tell us a little bit about Reclaim the Streets and also many of the green movements afterwards that he's helped and supported, and particularly campaigning for cycling, which I know he's won some awards for and things. So over to you, Roger.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to kind of have a little reflection about Reclaim the Streets to mark the fact that we're just coming up for the 30th anniversary of the first street party. I wanted to give a bit of an overview of what Reclaim the Streets was, what it did, what came after it, some reflections on what is its relevance, what is the relevance of all that stuff that went on, during Reclaim the Streets and its aftermath. What is the relevance? What can we learn from it today? I will kind of end on that sort of reflections as a prompt for discussion. I've little doubt you will have your own thoughts on that. But let me dive straight in. Great. Okay, fine. So there we go. 30 years on, reflections on what happened and during Reclaim the Streets and beyond. So there we go. I'll tell you what, I haven't done a slide on this, but let me just introduce myself briefly. So I kind of got involved in this stuff having left university without a green brain cell in my head, but I'd cycled around town as university students are wont to do. I left university in 1987. I decided to try cycling when I moved back to London, not because, as I say, out of any green conviction whatsoever. I didn't have any at that time. But just basically because it seemed like a good way of saving money, and frankly, it struck me as mildly eccentric, which I liked the idea of. So I did that, and then I discovered there was this thing called the London Cycling Campaign. I was cycling. I was in London. I could see where you might want to campaign for it, and via a kind of roundabout process, when the very first Reclaim the Streets action, which I hope I'm not giving away any street state secrets, but I think Shane was involved in organising some of this. So at that time, I was involved in the London Cycling Campaign, trying to get some cycle lanes painted on the Waterloo Bridge. That was a multi-year battle, which it should never have been. But when this call came into the London Cycling Campaign office, I think it was actually from Shane, the message got passed to me. So I went along and I met up with Shane and other people, and there was this direct action movement that was setting out to be I can't remember the precise wording, for pedestrians, for walking, cycling, and against cars, roads, and the bodies push, something like that. So that's how I first personally got connected with this whole movement that I will now outline. So let's just put it again, leaving aside my personal context, let's go into the sort of the political context of what was going on. At this point, I'm going to go back sort of 36 years, which is actually 3 years before first Reclaim the Streets' first activities, and as I say, 6 years before its first street party. I'll come on to why there's a distinction between its first activities and the first street party. But anyway, 1989. So this was a seminal year. This is the year after I left uni without a green brain cell in my head, but having just taken up cycling. And during that seminal year, 3 really interesting things happened. Firstly, the Green Party won 15% of the vote in the European elections that year. Secondly, Margaret Thatcher went to a United Nations summit and declared that as a scientist, she'd done a chemistry degree, as a scientist, she was convinced of the need for urgent action on the climate. And she devoted her speech to exactly that. That same year, her government launched what it described as the biggest road building program since the Romans. Odd little dissonance. Now, I was by that stage living in southeast London, close to one of the 3 main road schemes that attention focused on. The first one was Twyford Down in terms of when was it going to get built. The second was the one near where I was living in Oxley's Wood, southeast London, an 8,000-year-old ancient woodland in southeast London. And the third was the M11 Link Road. Oxley's Wood was the one that never got built. because of the success of the campaigns at Twyford Down. Let's just rattle forward onto the next slide. Hope it works.
That was incredible, wasn't it? The Oxford Wood one, because there was a 10,000 beat the bulldozer pledge or something, and because of what going on at Twyford, they backed off doing it, saved it, I think, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean the other thing about that is that at first, Friends of the Earth were going to sort of do a little bit of a rather tokenish sort of campaign at Twyford Down, and then this group that had this reputation called Earth First, Earth First had a reputation from having been formed in the United States, and they had this reputation as being eco-terrorists. So when people formed Earth First in the UK and started getting involved in Twyford Down, Friends of the Earth, frankly, ran away for fear of being associated with eco-terrorists, and then regretted it, because actually the eco-terrorists weren't terrorists. They did a very good job of peaceful direct action. And by the time we got to Oxley's Wood, the likes of Friends of the Earth and even the Wildlife Trust and other NGOs, quite mainstream NGOs, were forming an alliance that really did, as you say, beat the bulldozers. As well, thanks to, if you like, the noisy defeat of Twyford Down, we had a quiet victory at Oxley's Wood. Which paved the way for us to. Why is my slides moving on? Paved the way for us to fight the M11 campaign. Right, here we go. So there we go. First actions in 1992. A blockade on Waterloo Bridge, which is, as I say, why I got involved, because I was doing cycle campaigning on Waterloo Bridge. I got involved in the early actions of Reclaim the Streets. We did some demos at motor shows. The second photo down there shows a bloke in a sequined costume acting like a supermodel on the roof of a car at the, I think that was the Earl's Court Motor Show. We subvertised car posters. We put sort of health warnings up, like the health warnings that government required to have on the bottom of cigarette adverts. We put them on the bottom of car posters. We painted in some cycle lanes, as Shane will particularly remember. And we were effectively acting as a support group for the Twyford Down protest, which, as I was saying a moment ago, is the first of those big road schemes to go into direct action mode. We kept going down, with numbers kept growing over the next 6 months, culminating in a whole bunch of people openly breaking a court injunction that had been taken out by the Secretary of State to prevent people from trespassing and obstructing the work at Twyford Down. 2 days after that injunction breaking, after basically they'd invited the courts to send them to prison, the Oxley's Wood scheme got dropped. The Transport Minister at the time said it was nothing to do with it. Well, he made out there was nothing to do with the protests. It was his 12-year-old son who'd seen something about Oxley's Wood on Blue Peter and said, Daddy, please save the trees. Nothing to do with the protests, of course. Anyway, those prisoners were, that helped us win at Oxley's Wood, which freed us up to go on and shift our attention to the M11 Link Road. Of those 3 road schemes, it was like the Cinderella. Twyford Down, the edge of a national park, Shane Duration monuments, sites of special scientific interest, loads of protections. Oxley's Wood, an 8,000-year-old ancient woodland in South London, the M11 Link Road in northeast London, 350 homes that had been kind of left, effectively condemned since the government had decided it was going to knock them down back in the 1960s to build this road. Some of them are squats, some of them are on short-term lets, but they were all looking pretty run down. Nothing you'd think that an environmentalist would feel particularly motivated to say. But we did. We decided to focus on, in one way we got lucky. The construction work on the M11 Link Road started off at the leafy middle class end, which we thought was going to be a disadvantage to us, but actually it meant that there was a tree, a 250-year-old sweet chestnut tree in the middle of George Green in Wanstead, and the local residents had thought that it was going to remain unprotected because the road was going to go into a tunnel underneath. That sweet chestnut tree was declared a dwelling, which set a legal precedent that was used on many other road protests, where forcing bailiffs to evict people from any treehouse that got built in trees.
Because of the letter, was it? The letter that got sent to local kids. Brilliant.
delivered a letter to the tree. There's a crazy solicitor involved with the campaign, so took this to court as evidence that he was a dwelling. He won his point of law, and tree houses thereafter became dwellings, which obviously was not only helpful legally, but it was also a huge boost to the campaign in PR terms. John Vidal, who is then the Guardian's environment correspondent, told that story beautifully. And by the time that sweet chestnut tree had to be knocked down at 5 o'clock on a biblically wet December morning, there were 500 people gathered around it to protect it. There were all sorts of other things that got protected. We had a demo on the roof of the Transport Secretary, John McGregor, where we basically did a huge banner drop showing a road going through his house to highlight the damage that his road programme was doing to the homes on the M11 Link Road. But culminated with the defence of a little street called Claremont Road. Claremont Road was basically consisted of 3 sides of a rectangle. It came off a main road. It then turned parallel to the main road. It turned back onto the main road. In other words, it went nowhere. It just provided access to some homes. You can see the homes by the time they'd started to get painted and decorated and barricaded, ready to make for a spectacular eviction that happened basically in late November, early December, at the end of that year of the M11 campaign, year and a bit of the M11 campaign. The second photo is an aerial view of the eviction, by which stage we got a 100-foot high scaffold tower, which you can see in the background. You can see the street with netting strung up between the roofs and the trees that sat between the street and the underground line just behind the trees. So it took them 4 days to get people out from all the kind of bunkers, tunnels, and the rooftop towers. But during those 6 months, basically that street had been turned car-free, and it turned the whole place into a party zone. That's where the idea for street parties was born. Everybody had the idea of street parties. Nobody had the idea of street parties. It was just such an obvious follow-on from the M11 campaign as a way from moving the debate on from roads to cars. By this stage, we were already winning public opinion over to the idea that roads were a bad idea and the government should stop building them. 2 years later, after the Newbury bypass protest, which was probably the one that had the highest media profile, we saw the government cut its roads programme, that biggest road building programme since the Romans, got cut from an initial £24 billion to £1.5 billion. To anybody who ever says, does direct action ever do anything? That's a very good answer.
Roger, can we just get that figure once more? Because to me, I only found out years later, and that's a major victory. It was how many billion down to? I always thought it was about
down from 24 billion to 1.5 billion.
To 1.5, I was saying to 8 billion. Okay, to 1.5 from 24. That is a major victory. We won in so many places where they didn't destroy the trees or the sites of scientific interest. What an incredible victory! Wow.
Yeah, and basically, the road protest movement consisted of a small number of very noisy defeats, of which the Newbury bypass was the noisiest, but the Claremont Road was probably the longest lasting. And a whole load of quiet victories. Basically, any community group that was threatened by a road scheme could go to public inquiry and say, "Look, if we don't win, we will go into direct action. You know, nice middle class people, but we're prepared to take direct action," and they would win. And loads of road schemes got dropped on that basis. So, having effectively the inclusion of the M11 campaign, we were ready to move on from roads, which in one sense was an easy thing to oppose, in that roads are something that the government builds and everyone loves hating the government, whereas cars, it's a more individual thing. So it was obviously going to, in PR terms, it was going to be harder to kind of tackle the car. And yet the idea of street parties born on Claremont Road seemed like such a powerful way to do it, because it wasn't being anti-car, it was about celebrating the choice of the space you create when the cars aren't there. So that was really where the idea came from that got us going. So we had basically 2 street parties in London during our first year in 1995, the year after all the M11 stuff. One on Camden High Street, which was relatively easy to block because it was a one-way street, so we only needed to block it to motor vehicles at one end. We did that by getting two clapped-out old cars that pulled out of two side streets, smashed into each other, and provided something great for the children to play on, smashing up cars. And we partied for all the rest of the afternoon. It was a lovely fun day till the police decided to come in and pick a fight with the people, the last remaining people, as numbers started to thin out towards the start of the evening.
That one was amazing, Roger, wasn't it? I mean, that was the first one. It came out of the Rainbow Centre, the big old church we had, and it was transformed, that street, with the climbing frame and kind of sand pit, and and everyone wanted to be in the road anyway because of Camden Market. So it filled out for a day of the public joined with the protesters, and I don't think the authorities could tell which was which. And it was a great day.
Yes. We then followed a similar formula to literally only 2 months later on Islington Upper Street. We had to block both ends of the street. It was wider, but this time we used tripods to block the street. We had a sand pit for the children to play on. We had a sound system on a pink tank playing "What a Wonderful World." It was just glorious. And the idea started to spread to other towns and cities, and we had various other actions later that year where we kind of blocked streets in Streatham, Greenwich, and a few other bits and pieces. But the street party idea was rapidly catching on, being taken up by other people. By this stage, I knew I'd actually had. I'm pretty sure I was the first person to be contacted by the police's newly established forward intelligence team, who basically kind of took me for a long drive by, I think, intercepting a court warrant. So I didn't find out about a court date that I was supposed to appear at. They took me for a long drive and tried to get me to being informed. I had to play my cards really rather carefully in how I dealt with that. But at this point, we knew we were being watched a lot more carefully than we had been up till this point. So we took rather longer to plan our next street party in '96. It took 6 months of planning, a lot more care over secrecy. We had open meetings every week where people were getting involved in sort of producing fabulous banners. You can see some of the banners that got produced to fly over the whole width of the M41 motorway. It's no longer a motorway, but it was then, and we had about 8,000 people partying on it. The important difference was that the first two street parties, the Camden and the Islington street parties, we had a secret meeting location, which was literally one tube stop from the secret party location. Sorry, did I say openly advertised meeting point, secret party location? We just took people one stop on the tube. For the M41 street party, we had a rather more complicated plan, and we had backup plans and backups for backups. And wow,
Epic day.
Meeting up at Liverpool Street Station, which was firstly designed to make sure that the police couldn't shut it down without shutting a whole mainline station, but also to make them think we were going to the bank, and then we didn't get off the tube at the bank. Well, were we going to Tottenham Court Road or Oxford Circus or Marble Arch and Park Lane? Oh my goodness, they haven't got off at any of them. They must be going to the M41 at Shepherd's Bush. There was a very thin police line appeared just as we got our first tube load of people off the tube. You can see it in the top photo. The actual party site is just around the corner to the left. If you kind of follow the road round to the left, that takes you onto the M41. We got there eventually when more people started coming off tube stops on the other side of the police line, i.e. a bit further back at Notting Hill Gate. Then the police line crumbled, and there we all were partying, about 8,000 people on a motorway, with fabulous rave music, lots of ravers, all of whom had been criminalised by the Criminal Justice Act, and we formed a whole load of links with them. There were these fabulous banners and these amazing things called skirts, basically wooden frames draped in sort of Marie Antoinette style skirts, which were rolling around with sort of women waving really to the crowd at the top of these skirts. Underneath the skirts was a jackhammer, the noise of which was covered by the rave music, digging a trench in the motorway, and trees, which were actually sort of offcuts from the sweet chestnut on George Green, being planted.
Oh, beautiful!
It couldn't be reopened for the next several days. So that was a phenomenal kind of achievement. And the crucial bit was that the media could hardly demonise a bunch of people partying. It was just so obviously good fun. So, well, what next? If we have 8,000 people partying on a motorway, aren't we ready to overthrow capitalism? Well, it actually prompted a bit of a debate, and I will come back to that debate because I think it's one of the kind of interesting little sort of tensions within the movement is just how quickly do we try and move on to broaden out from something where we really had a very clear, readily understood message to something more abstract, like why do we want to overthrow capitalism? Actually, it went pretty well to start with, and I should say by this stage, I ceased to be kind of, central to the organising of this by about late '96 after the M41. So I am not the best qualified people to talk about the later stages of M41. There may be people here who know this bit of history better than I do, for all I know. So feel free to jump in. But yeah, the first move after that M41 party was to link up with Liverpool Dockers, who were on strike at that time. They had a very strong anti-capitalist critique. We linked up with them. We did effectively a solidarity action with them up in Liverpool. Then we held this huge demo on the eve of the 1997 general election, produced this spoof newspaper in the same typeface as the Evening Standard, called Evading Standards. We planned to hand it out free at tube stations to publicise this Never Mind the Ballots demo. Actually, going to Trafalgar Square wasn't plan A, it was only plan B. The original plan was to get to the Department for Environment now empty offices, but we couldn't get there because the police had sort of worked out that was the plan. So we ended up at Trafalgar Square instead, but you can see just how many people got there. Again, sadly, the police broke it up by triggering a riot at the end of the day. But before the police triggered riot, it was an incredible, beautiful day. Very, very festive.
That was, I think, the original plan was to be in the Department of the Environment, so people were going to occupy it. But the road to get through when we were going past the crowd was absolutely jam-packed with various police lines and things. The Evading Standards newspaper was brilliant. I mean, around the election, Evading Standards. And I think they came in and swooped and confiscated like 10,000 of them or something.
Yes, I was one of 3 people who was arrested about a fortnight before, and then was then bailed to prevent me going to the actual demo at Trafalgar Square. So I wasn't there. I got stuck on the outside because they bailed me to appear at a police station and then released me once the cordon was up, and there was 2 others who were in the same boat. But hey, we were the wrong. They were the wrong. They arrested the wrong people. We got £6,000 each by way of wrongful arrest payout, and we all good use of our activist wages, if you like.
What was important there, though, really was the linking up of the unions and the Liverpool Dockers and the environmental protest direct action movement. I remember some friends who said they went up to Liverpool to support them, and the unions were all picketing outside and standing blocking the gate, and then some of the kind of Earth First types said, well, why don't you get on the roof and the Reclaim the Streets lot? And they were like, so they ended up getting on the roof with the Liverpool Dockers. And they were like, oh, this is brilliant. We should do this more often. And then there was the big solidarity demo. But very important to get, many movements working together, shall we say.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, at first this kind of, moving into a sort of more overtly anti-capitalist critique went really well. That for all that the police were sort of, doing the damnedest turning it into, they're just mindless, violent anarchists and all the rest of it. You see, anyone who saw the images of what actually happened, like, no, that's not the reality. That's just the police's narrative. Following year, again, more broadly anti-capitalist stuff. This was a year when the G8 came to Birmingham. A lot of the sort of more mainstream NGOs, sort of development NGOs, were sort of having a huge protest about dropping the debt. Thousands of people joining hands to form a cordon around the G8 summit, and then we had a street party. And of course, the police went and demonized it all, and the NGOs felt they had to distance themselves from it, which was a shame. But we also had 2 lovely kind of smaller, more localized street parties in both North and South London on the same day. So one's going, increasingly global and linking up, and there were other similar street parties linked to the G8 in other cities around the world. So we were looking to globalize the protest as well as localize it with street parties on the same day in both North London and in South London. And those two bottom images are from Brixton and Tottenham, respectively. So still going well. 1999, Carnival Against Capitalism. So this was, again, I think this is when the IMF and World Bank were meeting, if I remember right. Incidentally, you can probably now see from the imagery on this slide where I got my garish colour scheme for this presentation. It was actually a Reclaim the Streets colour scheme for a while. There you go. That's sort of banners of both the poster we put out beforehand and then actions in the city of London with occupations of banks, particularly the Liffey building. This is where the futures exchange, futures were being traded in the Liffey building. I can't remember what Liffey stood for, but that was basically trading futures.
London International Financial Futures Exchange, I think it was.
Thank you. Thank you.
Keep going on this, but in a bit, could you say something on People's Global Action as well, if you're going to cover that?
Yes, did I mentioned, sorry, I did say I put People's Global Action on the previous slide and I then forgot to talk about it. Yes, you're absolutely right. Effectively, some of the folk who'd been involved in Reclaim the Streets were helping to spread that global movement that I touched on in the link into the last slide, that was basically starting to kind of support other similar movements to take off elsewhere around the world. Now, PR-wise, this was actually the point at which the police and the right-wing media started to get the upper hand over us in terms of demonizing us as mindless anarchy, mindless thugs and mindless violent thugs. It's sad to say it was a fantastic action, and yet we were beginning to lose the PR battle. I'll come back to my thoughts on why. But in doing so, we, as I say, over the next 3 years, we found ourselves increasingly internal arguments, unable to function. There's a really interesting question about what were the role of police spies. We know now that we had police spies in the movement. What role were they playing in kind of stirring up tensions internally? I don't really know. I'd be intrigued to share intel on this one. But we basically, Reclaim the Streets effectively fizzled out over the next couple of years. We had a guerrilla gardening action in the year 2000 where we sort of basically tried to dig up the sort of grass in front of Parliament, and a few other increasingly small and frankly increasingly ineffectual smaller protests. We sort of fizzled out over the next 2 years. We basically lost the ability to communicate via the media and bring more and more people so that we didn't have the weight of numbers that enabled us to outdo the police. But in doing so, we effectively lit a torch that then kind of went round a lot. In particular, it inspired the Seattle protests against the World Trade Organization later in 1999, so 6 months or so after the Carnival Against Capitalism, and that whole series of protests against globalization. Basically, wherever sort of the World Bank or G8 or whatever rocked up, there would be a protest. And sadly, they too got increasingly violent, with activists being shot in Gothenburg, one being shot dead in Genoa. Genoa was evidently horrible. And then the whole kind of globalization bandwagon moved out of doing their gatherings in cities, and instead they had a gathering out in the countryside here in Britain, up in Scotland, at the golf course, the hotel next to the golf course in Glen Eagles. So we had to work out, instead of having huge squats, which is what all those summits in Seattle and Prague and so on had, we had to work out how to set up a protest camp. And the protest camp was to be significant. That's why I've highlighted it. It forced us to work out how do we enable people to gather in tents, set up tents, set up food, set up recycling, set up compost toilets, all that stuff that we got to love in the climate camps that followed. The idea of a protest camp, born out of necessity when G8 came to Glen Eagles, provided the spark for the climate camp movement, which brought together quite a lot of the people who'd been involved in Reclaim the Streets and similar movements in Earth First around the country. So, right, we've got to get going again. We had climate camps against coal-fired power stations at Drax in 2006, and then in another coal-fired power station at Kings North in 2008. We had one against Heathrow Airport where they tried to brand us as terrorists. So we responded by having a photo call where we got the front page of the latest International Climate Panel on Climate Change. We got their latest report, stuck the front page of it on banners, and had a poster, a banner saying "We are armed only with peer-reviewed science." To make
that was brilliant. What a brilliant action! They're pictures of the scientists, aren't they? I think on the front. They're pictures of scientists and peer-reviewed science. That was a brilliant way of responding. Yeah. Yeah.
And the faces of some climate victims. So that was coal-fired, and between climate camp doing coal-fired power stations, we basically stopped a generation of new coal-fired power stations being built. They were about to go ahead with allowing a new coal-fired power station at Kings North on the pretense that carbon capture and storage will save it, will mean that it's climate neutral. Hey, what we do. Climate camp kind of ran its course. It then kind of got revived in a slightly different form as Reclaim the Power, which similarly held camps that were something to do with the climate, at mostly around fracking. Several times we were sort of dealing with fracking up in Lancashire, but we went some other places too, notably Bolcombe in Sussex, where they never did get to frack. Filed up in Lancashire, where they did test fracks, but never actually fracked commercially. We saw them off there and in various other places too. So a lot of wins. And it also other things that kind of got sparked by this. Firstly, Occupy London was basically started off as people from the climate camp, inspired by the Occupy movement in the United States, occupying the city centre, occupying London, occupied outside St Paul's Cathedral to make the point about what is the church doing about debt and all the rest of it. In Germany, they picked up on the idea of climate camps and took it way bigger than anything we'd ever dreamt of. The Ende Gelände, which basically means, this far and no further. The Ende Gelände movement was basically huge climate camps, far huger than anything we ever managed in the UK, shutting down absolutely enormous overcast coal pits, still going. And one Reclaim the Power activity actually provided the starting point for a meeting of people that morphed into Extinction Rebellion. And of course, the first Extinction Rebellion, the Pink Boat in Oxford Circus, has quite a lot of similarities in its style and positivity to that whole idea of street parties. It worked PR-wise. It worked very similarly in that the media tried to demonize Extinction Rebellion the same way they tried to demonize Reclaim the Streets. How do you demonize people dancing around a pink boat? It's just like, no, when people saw that, they just wanted to join in. And media and police attempts to demonize them just didn't work. Unfortunately, Extinction Rebellion kind of then gave the media every excuse to demonize them when they went and climbed on a train at Canning Town. But so I just wanted to end this by kind of throwing out some questions for thoughts and discussion. I touched on that point about moving on from the car, which was a clearly understood symbol of capitalism. We had a really good critique of the car effectively as a symbol of everything that's wrong with capitalism. It takes up all the space that children play in. It's bad for our health. It's bad for our climate. We have to spend huge amounts of money on military spending to defend the supply line of oil to fuel this great car economy. This was a phrase that Maggie Thatcher had used, the great car economy, and we were riffing on it very, very effectively. We were even able to point to the gross national waste product that came out of all the exhaust pipes, and boy, was it gross. There is a bit of me that thinks if we just stuck with that a little longer, we would probably have had an anti-catalyst movement that was harder to get at, that was better understood. But you know, how do I know? That's an alternative future that didn't happen. I invite discussion as to whether did we rush into being anti-capitalism just a bit too quickly. My hunch is we did, but who knows? I touched on this point about highlighting problems. You know, direct action is very good at going to something awful and saying, stop that, whether it's a road or an airport or a fracking site or whatever. It's much harder to do positive visions unless, as we did with Reclaim the Streets and indeed the Pink Boat and Oxford Circus, unless you can have your positive vision in a space where there was previously something really problematic, like traffic jams. So positive visions in the street actually works really well. So I think probably two of our best PR moments were when we transformed really busy streets, the M41 and then Oxford Circus, and showed positivity in that space. There's been a long-running debate about how far do you go in accepting that you will sometimes need to respond to police violence with violence. That debate has run and run. It's even through to the sort of South African movements. They eventually, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa eventually started off pacifist, but eventually adopted violence. But they came to be seen as a great movement. What about the media? We had all sorts of internal debates about whether we should be pandering to the media or just bypassing it. It's very difficult to bypass it, frankly. Even now, even in the age of social media, it's still very difficult to have the resources to outgun the mainstream media and the corporate-funded social media and all the rest of it. How do we avoid infiltration? As I touched on, we grew when we realised we had the police paying more attention to us after the first two street parties. We decided the only thing to do was we had to get bigger in order to. But there's only so far you can go up that curve. We also knew we needed to be able to localize, hence those two street parties. We didn't really localize sufficiently. We didn't really manage to bring it off, but we knew we needed to do it in order to have effectively sort of individual autonomous cells, as well as the ability to come together as a very big movement. But then when you talk about autonomous cells, you open yourselves up to pitfalls like that Extinction Rebellion action that did so much PR damage to Extinction Rebellion. All sorts of questions for a thought and reflection. And I'm just going to end with, which is, I suppose, a bit personal to me, having personally kind of gone back to my original single issue of cycling and sustainable transport. I just want to point out that graph at the bottom there, which I'm afraid you can't see what the legend terribly clearly, so I have to explain it. But the yellow, this is the emissions over time from 1990 to nearly present day from different sectors of the UK economy. And the top line, the yellow line, is electricity emissions. They've nosedived beautifully. That is thanks in no small part to the climate camp movement, stopping them building coal-fired power stations and fracking and all the rest of it, making sure that the energy was increasingly being generated by renewables resources. So we've actually had a real success story in terms of getting an energy sector, electricity generation emissions to come down. What's the line at the top there? The one that's hardly dropped at all? Transport. And yeah, we've also had limited progress in decarbonising agriculture and residential buildings. So in that respect, Insulate, Brent, were absolutely right. But transport is now the biggest emitting sector. Surface transport is about 29% of domestic emissions in the UK. It gets even bigger by the time you add in aviation and shipping. Is it time to get back to some of what we were doing back in the 1990s around roads, cars, and the bodies that push them? I've left my contact details on there. I'll come back to that slide just to spark discussion in a sec, but I do want to just conclude with what I mentioned at the outset. The plans to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the first street party with another one in, what is it, under less than a fortnight's time, Saturday the 17th of May. I have no idea who's planning this, genuinely. I don't know who's doing it. I don't know what the plan is other than what I found on a Telegram group. The Telegram link is at the bottom of the page. The plan is you can either join on foot. There will be 2 muster points, one of which will be announced at 12:30. The second will be announced at around about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You'll need a travel card to go anywhere within Zone 2. That is one option. The other option is come by bike, join the critical mass, which will meet up in the usual London critical mass meet-up place near the on the South Bank near Waterloo, under Waterloo Bridge by the National Film Theatre. It'll set off at 1 o'clock. And we'll meet somewhere, fingers crossed, and all will be festive. So take down that Telegram link, join up, see you on the streets on the 17th of May. I'll leave it there, and I'll just go back to that set of discussion prompts on the previous slide.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Roger. Absolutely incredible. Really condensed wisdom there from your, strategic work over many movements. Maximum respect, and a lot of things in there. Really good to see the journey through time. From Reclaim the Streets, spreading around the UK to going to international and People's Global Action. There's some very interesting points there, folks, for discussion or feedback or comments. Particularly there, the ones on highlighting the problem versus the positive visions. I've been on for a long time. Direct action's good at taking action against things, but what are we actually for as well, and putting that message out.
On that, the other thing that I would say is that I should have said on that point, specific targets versus capitalism. Capitalism is inherently an abstract concept. It's very difficult to do direct action on an ism. We did sort of succeed with Trafalgar Square, but as I say, that is why I just wonder whether if we use the car as a really potent symbol of what's wrong with capitalism, if we just start with getting that message across for a little longer, could we have built a more effective anti-capitalist movement over time? Who knows?
Shreya's saying she's already emailed her MP using low traffic future, Roger. Well, brilliant. I hope many more people watching this will check out low traffic futures work that Roger's doing and contact your MP. So there's a react button down the bottom. You can raise your hand and we can see anyone 1, 2, 3 like that. And, it can be a question, it could be a feedback, it could be a comment, it could be a remembering that, something that happened over those many years. So, anyone want to come back there? Shane, go for it. Yep. Or stick your hand up on the chat. Yeah, Shane, unmute. You have to unmute.
Unmute. Yeah. Just a quick comment on the sort of spiky versus fluffy debate that Roger reminded me of there, and also the ANC, but just a terminology question. The ANC weren't really violent towards people. After Sharpeville in '62, they decided they couldn't ask people to peacefully protest because they were just getting shot. They decided they didn't have the experience to go into sort of violent guerrilla warfare. And so they decided to go along with the tactics of divestment, boycotting, but in particular sabotaging mostly energy infrastructure. And, certainly legally, that is damage to property, not violence. Violence is generally against a person, although interestingly not against, trees and other living things. I just wanted to make that point because I think now it's becoming increasingly relevant again as peaceful protest gets very, very difficult to do, although Liberty's appeal against the government's definition of minor disruption has been one, so hopefully that should make it slightly easier. But, so groups like the Tire Extinguishers and Stop the System, which, are sort of, I would say Tire Extinguishers are the acceptable face of sabotage, if you like. If people are not familiar with them, you just put a mung bean or a lentil in a hubcap, a tyre screw, and just screw it onto the tyre, and that depresses the T lever and lets the air out the tyre. And they put a message on saying it's not you, it's your car. And Stop the System have taken to cutting optic cables going to insurance companies that finance fossil fuels. So, I think, like other movements, when peaceful protest becomes impossible, sabotage as opposed to violence sort of historically seems to be the next step on. And yeah, that's certainly a debate that was going on during RTS between the sort of black bloc, the fluffies versus the spikies. But it always made sense then to keep it fluffy, knowing that the media would jump on anything. And I think the other point to bring up is some of the police undercover spies in Reclaim the Streets, and in particular Jim the Van, Jim Boyling or Jim Sutton. He was one of the 6 people who knew about the Liffey building on J18 being the target, and it always struck me, and it was amazing when I was there, that there were no police there. There was pitched battles on the escalators going up to the trading floor. All the windows in the reception had been smashed. And the police, I think, took about 50 minutes to arrive, which, when you consider they knew that the target was the Liffey building, was extraordinary. And to me, smacks of media management, because after J18, the press, we were urban terrorists, violence, everything. And that gave the police and the media a lot more excuse to clamp down. Yeah, that's it.
Very interesting perspectives. It's very good you bring up, the current laws and how things have changed, because they've significantly, majorly, reduced our rights to peacefully protest, and those laws should be repealed and changed. And I hope Labour finds it in themselves to have something to push back on there. But I don't have much hope. But we need to campaign for our rights to protest for a lot of these things.
I think what Shane brought up is it would be really interesting to sit down for about 3 hours and discuss all that, because it's really complicated, the violence, non-violence, and all that. I thought it was magnificent the way Roger was able to link everything from the 90s right up to the current time, because in some ways you might have thought there was a kind of a break there between, I don't know, Extinction Rebellion and what went before, but interesting to see that kind of flowed through the whole thing. Yeah, and he didn't bring up that what's happening now is not so much sabotage, but there's serious demonstrations against insurance companies and banks and people that are behind the oil companies. There's a lot of fossil-free London, people like that, doing protests. Not serious damage, but blackening their windows and locking onto the inside and things like that. So that's another step that's happening right now. So again, instead of attacking cars, and then in addition to that, oil and gas, which is climate change and everything, what's behind the oil and gas, they can't function if they don't have insurance and don't have the banks. So got the Achilles heel, I figure. Anyway, lots more to say, but carry on. See what anybody else says.
I think that's really, really important there to make one of the links there that, Reclaim the Streets from that first one in Camden and then Islington, it started to spread around the country, and you got Brighton and Sheffield and Bristol and Norwich, whatever, all around the country. Leeds, Sheffield started doing street parties on a recipe as a tactic. This is your 10 steps to setting up a street party. It was one
there
of the
was one
beautiful
even in
things.
Streatham. Streatham had one too.
Yeah, and North and South London. What was beautiful is that any group could do that, get together a group of friends, make a flyer. A lot of this was just pre-internet or early internet, printing flyers, posters, stickers, earliest days of the internet. But how it then blossomed, I remember my mate Headstrong telling people about the internet is coming, and people saying, well, what's he on about this internet? And, if I want to send mail, I'll go down the post office. But as it came in a few years later, we were then, People's Global Action came out, and they went to big summits in Switzerland and around, and suddenly you were emailing Zapatistas in Mexico, and Indian peasant farmers movements, and the Indian peasant farmers movement came across to big summits in Europe with caravans. Suddenly the globe was linked up, and we were seeing each other's struggles. And one of Roger's points there about the role of the media, indie media, I think, was one of the best things that ever came out of, it was around Seattle, I think, was set up. And that was, don't hate the media, be the media. And I miss indie media. I wish it could come back again in some form or another, because citizens journalism that anybody could report from Hong Kong or Nairobi or Stockholm or London or Lima and say, this is what's going on now. And, bypass the main media and actually be
Yeah, you can get that on
so important.
various channels now, but you have to search for it. But people
Uh,
like Zoe is still interviewing and going to just about everything that's on in this country. It's incredible. They're doing really good filming and interviewing. But yeah, the struggle continues. It's discouraging sometimes, though, because you think, oh God, I'm never going to get anywhere.
I think it's important to remember the victories.
Keep your sense of humor, because we only have one life, probably, and you should enjoy it, whatever. That's why I play in the samba band. I go to a lot of demonstrations where we're just playing in the band.
Remember the humour. Monty Python humour helped us on many front lines.
So I would definitely be on the sort of the fluffy side versus the spiky. But there was this thing about growing popularity without using. Obviously, everybody knows, that there is a worst case scenario with climate change, but using that as a kind of recruitment lever kind of leaves a bad taste sometimes, because especially with young people, not to sound too portentous here, but when we're young, we're very kind of vulnerable to that whole it's the end of the world and it doesn't matter what we do because the world is ending, so we're going to take risks with ourselves and our future. And I get it. I'm not against young people being free and doing what they want to do. I mean, don't get me wrong in that sense. Just that, it can get a bit culty if that was always the thing when I was young. That was always the thing that we were onto, was like, well, this is what we don't want to become. We don't want to become like that. We don't want to be, if you're in Earth First, it's because you don't want to be in anything like that's, hierarchical and so on and so on and so on. So that's kind of comment on Roger Geffen's discussion points, really, just a little roundup.
I'm glad you said that. I think it's really important. I've been saying it around the movement for a long time that it's very important with one hand to be doing direct action and be aware of the doom scenarios and stopping whatever you can. But if we only focus on the doom and what we're against, then what are we actually for? What are the solutions? What are our visions for the future? And I've encountered a lot of younger people at the festivals over the last couple of years who've felt really, really depressed because they've only done the doom scrolling and the bad situation. They've been told the world's ending and all sorts of nonsense. The world isn't going to end. The world will go on for a long time.
Or, the doom spiraling and the depression and the mental health problems.
I think
get
Shreya's
it.
got a point there. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry, go on.
I feel like I'm in a position to say, as a young person of today, that that like I'd rather be in this cult or this frame of thinking than focused on what my friend's buying and like worried about what Louis Vuitton nonsense rubbish or what's going on.
You don't want to be in a cult. You just don't.
No, okay, yes, in a very sense. Sorry, yes, I'm blowing over genuine cults and like situations where bad things happen, but sorry, but I just meant I'd rather be focusing on creating a more beautiful future for a collective.
That's a good point.
It's not about that charismatic one individual. If you look at the Reclaim the Streets and Roger Geffen and all that, it's kind of everybody's working on it. There's not like, you're tapping into a spirit, but you're not like, you'll have things that you agree on.
That's a really good point, Helen, and and Sharia as well. A lot of our generations are bombarded by consuming and if I just focus on that, and also a lot of these movements for years were non-hierarchical. You know, we didn't have a specific leader. There were, you know, people working in circles, working in facilitators, coordinators, actively trying to level things. There are visible and invisible hierarchies in many groups and movements and things, but actively try to not have the main, you know, leaders and have horizontal organizing. And then more recent movements have been very less horizontal, shall we say? But you know, learn from all of the movements. And yeah, Roger. Or anyone else?
Just picking up from what I think Helen was getting at, and I may have misunderstood this, was, you know, the point about cults as a motivator for people to get involved, you know, and the suggestion that you get involved because the world's going to end and therefore you need to sacrifice yourself, go to prison, all that sort of stuff. And I think that what this does relate to this point about being able to communicate a positive vision, which, as I say, we did really well with street parties, and then Extinction Rebellion did really well, particularly with its first action with the pink boat. And I think that I did make the point that it's actually quite difficult to do direct action that communicates a positive vision, unless what you have to get something negative out of the way first, which is, I think, why doing direct action around positive visions in the streets is actually really rather powerful.
And also, I think we need to focus on the solutions and the things that we are and the positive. So I like solar punk and other things. We need to give people some hope. And it is really bad. I've been bombarded as an activist with doom news for 30 years. But we have to give people hope, and there is hope. There is lots of good people and projects and campaigns. So the old thing, with one hand do the direct action, and with the other hand create the kind of futures and the projects and things you want to see. Neil, I don't know whether you can unmute, if I click unmute again, or whether you can, because you were at the M11 and the others. And anyone else, if you've got a comment, a feedback, question, or anything you want to share there from down the time and years. Really interesting discussion tonight, and you see how the movement has changed, evolved, and grown. It was an education, Roger. Absolutely, Don. Brilliant.
Very good.
And we have the esteemed Murray Bookchin with us tonight as well.
Very honoured.
Very
Really?
honoured. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, we chart some of this with the Resistance exhibition, and I see it as like 7 or 8 waves of the movement. And you know, personally, I got involved with Twyford Down and the road protest movements. But before us, there was Greenham Common, there was the Free Festival movement, there was the poll tax stuff. There was, you know, and how movements flow on into each other. The road protests turning into, you know, Reclaim the Streets, spreading around the UK, that going to People's Global Action, moving on out into, you know, Europe. The first one I went to was Prague, IMF World Bank, but the one in Seattle was incredible. I think Sheila told me a few beautiful tales about a big organising room, and they were blocking all the different, you know, intersections. But it scuppered the WTO, which was a unelected, undemocratic organisation that just set itself up and started making these international trade laws, kind of thing, and nobody could get in apart from by helicopter because everything was blocked, and that started a massive movement and indie media that went on, and we linked up with Zapatistas and Indian peasant farmers movements, you know, in Prague and things like that. And it became an international, massive, massive movement, really, up to Genoa, where there was 250,000 people on the streets. And post that, there was 9/11, and that suddenly moved into an anti-war movement, and then on into kind of, you know, climate camps and Occupy and the anti-fracking movement. We have had so many victories, from the Greenham Common women through to the road protests, through to, you know, anti-fracking. Direct action gets results, folks, but let's create the futures we want to see as well. Sheila, do you want to say a little on Seattle there?
Well,
and then the others, over.
I just wanted to ask if you were in Seattle, because I was.
No, I would have loved to go there. No,
it was totally amazing.
Prague.
It was totally amazing. And what, you know, you see the films, you see the, you know, the violence and all that, but the organization was amazing. And it was just really organized. And I could go on about that for half an hour, but how much time. But the interesting thing was that in addition to all the kind of what the press calls anarchists, but all of us, there was also the unions were, you know, really pissed off with the World Trade Organization, and a lot of, you know, mainstream environment as well. And the city itself put on sort of, because they were hosting this great event, and so there was a lot of sort of mainstream events going on as well. And some of the churches opened up and had events, but also helped people out, and people got arrested and they helped. So it wasn't just the usual people blocking the streets. There's a whole range of people there, and it just worked incredibly well. It was very exciting.
I think that more, modern words, intersectional, but bringing together all those alliances of many different groups and cultures, and
Yeah.
the churches getting involved and the unions getting involved. Building alliances is really, really important. And you saw
This
that
has been built up for quite a few months before they actually. And then they'd obviously had a big discussion internally. I'm sure I don't know personally, but I'm sure this happened between the spikies and the fluffies or whatever, because that's the Black Bloc. It was kind of, I don't know if it first appeared there or if it was first in Germany or whatever, but there was a group, the Black Bloc, that weeks before decided we're not agreeing to not causing any criminal damage, because the rest of them said we're having no criminal damage. We're just, blocking the roads and that's it. And so the Black Bloc said, no, we're doing some more. And it turned out that when they were there, first place, most of them seemed to be women, and they were all wearing black and masks and everything. But in addition to spraying some things and breaking a few windows, they also were really helpful. And so if you needed more people, you'd say, hey, more people, and they'd come running over. or you said, take some messages over to this other group in another street, and they'd do that. So they were quite useful as well. That was quite fun.
It was also like the Samba Band. I think the Samba Band was created so that you could help to move over pavements and move, groups of people, and rhythms of resistance being born.
Yeah. They had a really good band. It was a really tight knit band. They had radical cheerleaders, which is quite funny.
Yeah, it was amazing.
DM boots and dreads and everything. Cheerleaders.
The pink and silver Samba Band fashion spread throughout Europe. Neil, can you hear us? Do you want to say a little bit about the M11 or anything there? I don't know if you fixed your Neil Goodwin.
These guys.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I'm completely blind because I can't see anything. I don't know how to work this out. But if you can hear my voice, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. And I caught I caught a bit of Roger's chat, and it's been very inspiring that we're going to have another go at it, and hopefully a whole new generation are going to see the potential of group actions and empowerment on the streets. But also, it's going to be weird to see it in the context of what's going on with the legislation and the way that the state's gone with closing down pretty much all avenues of protest. Apart from, I reckon Article 10 is about the last thing, but then old Farage wants to get rid of Article 10, the right to expression. So look forward to it.
I mean, you were at the M11 and you videoed a lot of, the early days there in Claremont Road, and how, people brought the indoors, outdoors from the buildings and turned what was a car space into a public space. And did you get video footage of M11 Claremont and some of the street parties, Neil?
I filmed the first one in Camden quite intensively, and I've actually got it up on my channel, which is on YouTube, called Counterculture 23. It's at Counterculture 23. If you just put Camden Street Party, it'll come up. And it was really worth putting the effort in. And I think I saw you actually, Phoenix, raving away with Rink Dink and a lot of other faces. And it was a beautiful day. They crashed two cars together. I think it was Mike Edwards, unfortunately, R.I.P. Mike, but he crashed into old Mick's car and on the intersection, and then just as everyone was piling out of the tube and then kicked the crap out of these cars, stood on them with a huge banner saying "Reclaim the Streets," and just this general kind of flow, because it's quite a buzzy place anyway, Camden. So it was like almost like the tourists were thinking, oh, this must happen all the time, Camden, and it was beautiful. It was a really beautiful day, and I captured it, and particularly the dancing. There was singing, there was choirs, there was Des was there with his kind of contraptions that he makes.
Yeah.
People were juggling in the streets. They had seats, car seats laid out, carpet laid out. You know, kids climbing frames. Yeah, it was really well done, and it set the tone. You know, after that, then was Islington. Actually, I've got just to point out, I've got on my channel the original Reclaim the Streets, the movie, which covers all these actions, and it was done really well by a guy who got quite paranoid towards the end. And because I think he started to suspect, well, he suspected what we now know as the spy cops, and he freaked out a little bit and sort of disappeared. I think he was from Spain, but he made the Reclaim the Streets, the movie, and something really spooked him, and I think that was, you know, he got an inkling as to what was going on with the state and infiltration. He got a glimpse of it, and it freaked him. But the film he made, I've updated it to include the Reclaim the Streets. The actual I think it was Bob Boland. Was it Boland? Was part of that. Some sort of action that he was part of. Yeah, I
Jim.
think it was
Yeah.
the transport. Was it the transport? Was it the transport place? Anyway, I've updated the film to include that. So you know, but yeah, it's called Reclaim the Streets, the movie.
I'm trying to find your channel.
Sorry.
Is it Counterculture 23 on YouTube? Is that where you type in?
That's right. Yeah.
At Counterculture.
Yeah.
I'm finding a channel at the moment, but maybe find a link, and if someone can pop it in the chat if they find that. Absolutely fascinating tonight. Thank you, Neil. I mean, really check out Neil's stuff online. If you don't know if you can post it in the chat, Neil, or anyone else can find it, Counterculture 23, or you got a few channels, I think, haven't you, Neil? You got amazing, incredible footage from the M11 and Claremont Road. Neil was one of the early, you know, videographers and chroniclers of our movement of movements, and you know, have no doubt that we have changed the world through all these bicycle actions and giant puppets and boats and you know, all sorts of, you know, incredible actions that are done by people in a very Monty Python creative kind of frontline humour, and it has, you know, tactical frivolity, you know, the Pink and Silver and Samba Band, and doing it with music. And I think when I've been to the international summits, you see how much some of the international crews have been inspired. One little story, I think we went to Copenhagen Climate Summit, and there was a lot of climate campers there, and I'm there with my mate Fluffy, who's original Rainbow Centre crew, and had this kind of Danish alternative social centre cafe. There was this massive 30-foot wall covered in posters and bands and events and this, that and the other, and right in the middle of like 100 posters on the wall was, you know, Camden, Reclaim the Streets, Camden, poster number 1 next to it, you know, Reclaim the Streets, Islington, poster number 2, right in the centre of their collage. And I looked at Fluffy over a drink or whatever, and I went, we helped do that, you know, look at that. That's inspired the Danish crews, and, you know, and they were doing their own street parties, you know. At the end of the day, it was a tactic, and 10 steps. Anybody could do it. They can still do it anywhere around the world. So get out on your streets and reclaim the streets. Have a people's assembly on the end of it, I think, is the one I'd like to lob in on the end there. Around it, I think they did that at Copenhagen. There was a big people's assembly outside the summit. It got a bit surrounded. But after that was a call from Copenhagen to have people, NGOs, activist groups, and indigenous groups all said we need to have people's assemblies all over the world. And we came back from Copenhagen, pumped that a lot, did the People's Assembly of Parliament Square, occupying against illegal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, kept bumping out. And I think a year or so later, the Occupy movement happened. And also you had the Arab Spring, and I think the 15M movement of Spain said they were inspired by the tent occupations of Parliament Square. So have no doubt that all of our actions, from puppets to camping in tents to whatever it is, to music, you know, the butterfly's wings creates things, storms in other places, shall we say. So keep networking wherever you are. Roger, I'll pass over to you for final words. And thank you so much for coming. You're someone I massively respect for, you know, you've been in there, you know, at it, networking and creating and strategizing for many, many movements in the London cycling campaign, right up to being awarded MBE via cycling campaigning. So big respect to you, Roger. Over to you for last words, and thank you very much for coming and sharing your your wisdom and your strategies. Ongoing debate. Roger, over to you for final words.
Oh, wow, thanks. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been lovely to see familiar faces, unfamiliar faces, young faces, older faces. Lovely to see you all. But the really important bit is see you out in the streets. See you on November the 13th. Shall I just
17th May.
Pull those details into the chat from my present? If I can just get back to my presentation, I can probably pull them onto the chat again, can't I?
Yeah, if you can put, there's a Telegram chat. It's the 17th of May, Saturday, I think. Telegram chat for meetups and things, and it's in the presentation now. We should have this video out soon. But absolutely, really, really important to stand up for our rights to peacefully protest and get together wherever we are. Pop a little comment in the chat if you want. I'm going to stop the recording there, but if anyone wants to stay around and chat, we always leave it on for 15, 20 minutes for anyone. And thank you very much, Roger, and to everyone who came. Keep networking wherever you are for a positive future.